And welcome again to Washington Unplugged. Bob Schieffer here. Well, President Obama makes a debut of sorts on the world stage this week, becoming the first U.S. president to chair a UN Security Council summit. Then later in the week, he'll be leading the so-called G20 in Pittsburgh. With the healthcare debate getting so much of the attention back home, it's easy to forget that there are some very serious things going on abroad, from reviving the Middle East peace talks to Iran, North Korea, the international economy. This morning, he addressed a UN session on climate change, addressing his administration's actions to combat climate change in the last 8 months. He urged world leaders to come together to tackle a problem that could lead to an irreversible catastrophe, as he called it, in the coming years. So what's the plan now? Where does he go on foreign policy? Joining me to discuss it today from the Council on Foreign Relations, James Lindsay, and Heather Conley, a senior fellow with CSIS, that's the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. She served in the Bush State Department. James Lindsay, let me just start with you. What are the priorities now that this president is facing abroad? We just hear so little about it, other than, that he's going to have to make some hard decisions on Afghanistan, but there's a lot going on beyond our shores.
It's a great question, Bob, and I think your opening made the point exactly right. We spent much of the past several months focusing on domestic issues, particularly health care, and this week at the United Nations is a reminder of how crowded President Obama's foreign policy inbox is. Not only does he have a lot of problems, they're really difficult, messy ones to deal with. I think what you can expect tomorrow in the president's speech to the UN General Assembly is that he will try to lay out his vision of American leadership going forward. He's going to repeat the theme he has emphasized throughout his both his campaign and first months in office, which is America is willing to do its part, but it needs others to help. And the president, unfortunately, has lots of problems he has to deal with all at the same time. And that's really the challenge to the White House. A lot of problems, many of them you can't put off, but at the end of the day, time in the White House is limited. So it's a very tough challenge to make it all work together.
Heather Conley, you don't do this. Presidents can't do it because they can't really set priorities. Events have a way of setting their own priorities. But if he could line these up in order, how would you line them up? What's the toughest thing he's got to do? What's the first thing he needs to do? Where does he go from here?
Well, this has been a dizzying week on foreign policy issues. It really began on Thursday with President Obama's major reversal on the missile defense policy in Europe, and it really runs straight through till October 1st to the Iran talks. So how do you set priorities in an incredibly dizzying array of foreign policy issues? The president's speech tomorrow to the General Assembly really ends what I would call the introductory phase of the administration's foreign policy. The president has been just going like crazy on summits, major foreign policy set pieces, the Cairo speech, the Prague speech. This sort of concludes that chapter. He has differentiated himself multiple ways against the Bush administration. He's set out, he's a multilateral approach. Now the rhetoric has come to the end. Now it's time for action, and that's what I think we need to see, starting in New York, setting the tone for not only the rhetoric, but the action.
James, do you see anything happening in New York? There are obviously going to be meetings with Israeli leaders. Does anybody think there's going to be any kind of breakthrough, even a small one, on those problems?
The chances of breakthroughs on these issues are pretty small. I think we need to keep in mind that we didn't get into the jam we're in right now in foreign policy in a week, so a few days speeches aren't going to wrap things up. I think what you will see is the president try to lay down some consensus for people to rally around. I would expect you'll hear coming out of the discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas later today, some hopes for some next steps on dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I expect to hear the president lay down some markers for the world on dealing with non-proliferation issues and strengthening the so-called NPT regime when he chairs the Security Council, Special Security Council session on Thursday. But again, I think really this is a week in which to sort of lay some markers down to establish some goals, hopefully get some tentative agreement from the other major players to go forward. But I wouldn't expect any stop the presses, game-changing outcomes from this week.
Is that generally your view of it, Heather?
Absolutely.
And what should we be looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of photo ops, a lot of important conversation when the president chairs the Security Council meeting on Thursday to talk about the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It's going to be an approach to Iran and North Korea saying this is a global issue. We've got to get our arms wrapped around it. But really the talks that are going to count, quite frankly, are some of the bilateral conversations that the president will have. Tomorrow he meets with Russian President Medvedev. We'll see if there's any indication, any movement on the Russian position based on the president's decision announced on Thursday about missile defense. It has huge implications, obviously, for Iran and a discussion October 1st on enhancing Iranian sanctions. I don't think we'll see much in New York when the action switches to Pittsburgh later in the week for the G20. I think you'll see a little bit more concrete action.
Let me ask you about this strategy on the missile defense, not putting the missile system on the borders of Russia. A lot of people who agree with that also think that maybe he should have tried to have gotten something in exchange from the Russians. Do you think he'll get anything from the Russians now? Will they take a harder look at what they might do on the Iran situation because of this?
My view, the administration made a decision based on the missile defense, on the technology and on the threat. And I think they made that decision based on those outcomes. The problem with the announcement and the timing of the announcement and how it rolled out had some important implications. It certainly had huge implications for the Poles and the Czechs coming on the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland. The timing could not have been worse, and how it was rolled out, it was abrupt. It caused problems with two important allies in NATO. But coming just a few days before the Obama-Medvedev bilateral meeting, the negotiations on the new START regime began on Monday. It had that sense of linking, but I think our expectations should be quite low on seeing any important Russian concessions either on Iran, enhancing sanctions, or in fact seeing much visibility on improving the atmosphere for the START talks.
Just a little time left here, James. What are your expectations when he meets with Medvedev? Do you think the Russians are going to be in a better humor?
They'll be in a bit better humor, but I don't expect the Russians to produce much of anything or make concessions for all the reasons that Heather ably laid out. I think it's important to understand when we talk about the missile defense issue that for the Russians, missile defense system in Poland and Czechoslovakia was a very convenient whipping boy to criticize the United States. The Russian nuclear arsenal was never threatened by this system that would have consisted of 10 interceptor missiles. So there was really nothing the Russians were going to give up in exchange for it, because it fundamentally wasn't that important issue. It was more a rhetorical device in which to talk about what they described as overreaching, overbearing, arrogant American power.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you. A very illuminating discussion this morning. And thank you for watching Washington Unplugged. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow at 12:30 on CBSNews.com. I'm Bob Schieffer.